St. Vincent de Paul was born of a poor family in 1580 in France, and he was well educated. He became a priest at the age of 19, and he acquainted himself with the wealthy of his area where he lived and kind of had of life about him. But he was captured as a young priest. He was captured by pirates, and he was sold into slavery to a plantation owner eventually. And the owner of that plantation was an ex-priest who had a wife and 3 children. And St. Vincent de Paul managed to convert that priest back to the church and travel with him to Rome and other places to make contacts so he could return to his work as a priest. And he was assigned to a village in Châtillon to be pastor there. It would be equivalent of our Appalachia area in the United States. And he became very moved by what he saw in the poor and the abandonment that they felt. And he started to gather people around him that would bring food and clothing and necessities of life that they needed. He eventually gathered a group of men around him who became seminarians and priests. He eventually founded the Vincentian order of priests who would work for the poor. St. Vincent de Paul was really concerned about the clergy, who were rather corrupt at the time. And he did a great deal to reform the seminaries and reform seminary formation. So his work with the poor and his work with the clergy were outstanding things for Vincent de Paul. Personally, he wrote that he had a very irascible temperament, that he said if it were not for God's grace, he would have been a very cross and awful person. But he said that he had to kneel down every day before God to ask him for help so that he could curb his temper. You would never think of it when you see him today in statues with a child in his hand, and he looks so gentle and kind. And he says in his writings that the Lord made him a very tender gentleman eventually. But he said it was that cross of his temper that he forced him to kneel and get closer to God every day. And so he thanked God for that cross. And eventually he became a very tender-hearted person. It's a good lesson for us as we struggle sometimes with various sins in our lives. St. Vincent de Paul is known as the Apostle of Charity. As you know, there are St. Vincent de Paul societies throughout the entire world. I was amazed when I traveled to Europe and different places and go into a Catholic church, and you could, without even knowing the language, you could see Vincent de Paul Society in every church in the world. And so he started something which was a recognition of the poor. So in the Office of Readings, he says that don't be upset if your prayers get interrupted so that you're called to help the poor because you're going from God to God. And he also said that be careful not to be upset with the poor who are often very rough and uncultured. And because he said they are imitating the person of Jesus Christ who was born poor. Interesting thought. So this from him about seeing Christ in others, about our charity that we talked about on Sunday. And so we ask the Lord to help us imitate him and try to see Christ in the poor. Let us stand and offer our prayers and petitions.